Hi everyone, welcome back to another video. This week we're gonna talk about producing multiphonics, and we're gonna actually dive into multiphonics themselves. Over the last 2 weeks we kind of had an introduction to the principles behind multiphonics and kind of learned a little bit about voicing and how to control our tongue. So we're gonna put it all together this week and kind of dive into the details of producing multiphonics. So the most simple way, or an oversimplified way of explaining how to play multiphonics, is that we know that one fingering can produce multiple pitches just by changing our voicing. So in order to produce multiphonics, you take that fingering and the two voicings to produce two different notes, and you kind of find an in-between of the two voicing and you'll get a multiphonic. I know, it's very simple, right? Now, go and try it. No, I'm just kidding. So how we exactly achieve that is a little more complicated. I wouldn't say complicated, it just takes a little more practice because it's not something we're used to doing, and at first it feels very strange, and there's a lot less room for error when it comes to multiphonic voicing. So when we play a monophonic note, our tongue can change quite a bit without affecting the register or the sound. So that whole time I'm moving my tongue around, the tone quality may have changed a little bit, but you know it's a G, and it didn't squeak, it didn't grunt, the pitch didn't vary too much. But with multiphonics, it's the slightest movement can cause you to lose the multiphonic sound. So if we use the same fingering and we play the multiphonic of the G and the note below it, so those two notes. So when I was holding that multiphonic, I moved my tongue a little bit, and all we heard was the top note. I move a little bit the other way, and all we heard was nothing. Okay, so multiphonics are a lot more precise in terms of the voicing that we need to produce them, and that's why it's a lot more difficult to control. Okay, so in my research, I discovered that there's basically 4 ways you can move your tongue depending on which multiphonic you're playing. All the multiphonics I ran into, which is like 600 something, cannot be produced with one of these 4 methods. Well, 3.5, but we'll get into the half a little bit later. So the first one we're going to talk about is playing the undertone multiphonics. So what this means is that the fingering we use usually produces a note in the clarinet register or the altissimo register. That means it uses a register key or an alternate register key. If you don't remember what alternate register keys are, it's usually just an open tone hole that is used to act as a register key. So if you're playing in the altissimo, say that's a fingering for altissimo E. You have one register key, and then this tone hole here acts as a second register key. That's what we call an alternate register key. Other common alternate register keys in multiphonics are the throat A, throat G, and the side throat keys, all 4 of them. Okay, and of course the first open tone hole. So those are alternate register keys, and the multiphonics we're talking about today are they all use an alternate register key, I believe. Most of them do. So the easiest example of this type of multiphonic is just the high C and the open G pitch that sounds below it. So So with all the multiphonics categorized, put into this category, the method of production is just well, first of all, figure out the voicing for the top note, okay, and then from there, just kind of do the same thing we did to get all the undertones last week in the voicing video. So raise the back of your tongue a little bit more. So kind of, if this was my tongue and this is the back, this is the front, I'm kind of rocking it up and back. Well, the front comes down and back a little bit, and it kind of just rocks where I'm reaching kind of towards the top with the back of my tongue. So that's more or less the same as what we were doing in the previous voicing video to get all the undertones, but we're not going as far. You may have noticed that, especially with the C, B, and A fingerings, you don't really have to use your tongue to get the undertones. You can just use your embouchure. You can do the same for multiphonics, but when you do that, the pitch is more difficult to control. Okay, I usually actually like to tighten up my embouchure a little bit more when I play these multiphonics, just so that the pitch is more stable, and this can be done entirely with just my tongue, and that way it'll be there will be a little bit more core to the sound as well if I tighten up my embouchure a little bit. Let's see if I can, well, let's see if you can hear the difference on camera. So this is how I would normally do it, with my embouchure just tightening a little bit. And then this is what happens if I get the multiphonic by loosening my embouchure and not using my voicing as much. So I don't know if you can hear that on the recording, but to me it's a lot more airy sounding. It's a lot more difficult to maintain, and I don't feel like I'm as in control of the multiphonic. And also the top pitch is very flat. Okay, so I don't advise using embouchure to get this type of multiphonic. Of course, there are exceptions. If you go down to G or F or E, you might have to loosen up your embouchure a little bit just to get the undertone and get the multiphonic to speak. But when you're playing notes down there, the acoustic resonance of the clarinet is very strong, and it takes a lot of embouchure change in order to change the pitch. For example, if we were just playing monophonic notes, we're playing a C6, and if we loosen our embouchure a little bit, the pitch will change. Whereas if we do the same thing with an E or a D, the pitch won't change as much. It still changes a little bit, and I'm loosening my embouchure a lot. Well, I'm loosening my embouchure by the same amount for both notes. But it takes a lot to change the pitch of the lower clarion notes compared to the upper clarion notes. So when you play multiphonics that involve a longer tube, if you need to loosen up your embouchure just the slightest bit, that it can help a little bit. But when you're playing short tube multiphonics, I advise against using your embouchure to achieve the multiphonic, because it can be done purely by voicing, and actually tightening up your embouchure a little bit will help with the sound. Sorry, I had to sneeze. Like I was saying, with the easiest example of this type of multiphonic is the C6, upper clarion C. And there's a couple things that make this like one of the easiest multiphonic. So first of all, we're all familiar with kind of the grunt that we get with beginner students, or some of us ourselves have, well, I assume most of us have at some point in our career learning to play the clarinet gotten those grunts, whether it's when we first get up to the note, or when we're trying to learn articulation, we get a lot of the grunts. That's just because our voicing isn't in the right place, but it's kind of how we're going to get this multiphonic. So it's something we're all familiar with. That's why this is such an easy example. Also, acoustically, it uses a very short tube. Short tubes make the multiphonic quite easy to speak. So, of course, if you want to play a multiphonic, you have to be able to produce, more often than not, you will have to be able to produce both notes of the multiphonic with the given fingering before you can actually produce the multiphonic, because it's very difficult to know, well, in order to achieve the multiphonic, you have to play both notes, or else I can't tell you to play something that you're not physically capable of doing. So same thing with multiphonic. It is still two notes, so you would have to be able to play both notes. With very few exceptions, you will have to be able to play both notes in order to play the multiphonic. So some of the other things that make this type of multiphonic more difficult is that if the top note is between C5 and G5, so in the lower clarion register, like I mentioned earlier, if the tube length is a little bit longer, the clarinet resonance is very strong, so it's a little more difficult to break that resonance and get a multiphonic to speak. Also, some other aspects that make this type of multiphonic difficult is if it's in a really high altissimo register, because up in the higher altissimo, our tongue is already very high, and it feels very, very unnatural to keep moving the tongue up higher. But that's what we have to do in order to get these multiphonics to speak. Another thing that makes it more difficult is that if the fingering itself uses an alternate register key that is lower on the clarinet. So if it uses one of the lower trill keys, or in some cases if it uses the first open tone hole, it's quite a bit lower than your regular register key and your top trill key. So those multiphonics are a little bit more difficult to speak. There is one exception to that rule, however, is that if one of these lower alternate register keys just so happens to split up the sound wave perfectly in the perfect place that both notes are very easy to come out, then those are actually quite easy. Well, it's for those, it's easier to get a multiphonic than the individual pitches. But in most cases, if the alternate register key is lower down on the clarinet, it's a little bit harder. So I'm going to give you a few examples of those. So first one, where the top note is lower on the clarinet, we'll just use a very simple example. We'll use the clarion F and try to get the multiphonic below. So it's a little less stable, and I do have to drop my embouchure a little bit, not a lot, a little bit, to get the note to speak. So that is one of the more difficult ones. One that uses an extreme altissimo note. Let's pick one here. We'll use this one. It's an E quarter flat. and a Xiaoyumo E. So the fingering is basically your Clarinet G sharp plus the second finger here. So the two notes by themselves. Yeah, it's quite difficult, and I'm just picking these multiphonics right out of my fingering chart, so I haven't really practiced them beforehand. And this I have labeled as one of the more difficult ones. So in case you're wondering, the fingering chart I'm using is on my website under resources. It's part of my dissertation where I compiled a bunch of, like, I think 600, a little over 600, 604 or 5 something, the multiphonic dyads. And all the multiphonics we're talking about today are labeled B, category B. But yeah, so I'm just picking these multiphonics out of my fingering chart, and that one was rated a 4 out of 5 difficulty. So let's try that one again. As you can tell, it's very unstable. Okay, I can't really get it to stabilize right now, but that's kind of the idea. If it's in a higher register, then it's a little more difficult. Let's now pick something with a alternate register key that is a little bit lower on the clarinet. Let's see. So this one, like I said, what is considered a low alternate register key is if it's the first finger here or one of the lower trill key. So this fingering is thumb, 2, 3, 1, 3, and your E flat. Okay, so this would be the alternate register key. The notes here are Clarinet G, G5, and E flat in the bottom of the treble clef. E flat 4. Okay, this one's a little bit better than the previous one, but it's still quite unstable. It's also a multiphonic where the top note is quite low, and like we said, that also makes the multiphonic quite hard. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this week. We're just dealing with multiphonics that use alternate register keys, and if you were to just play the note with the multiphonic fingering as you would normally, you'll probably get a clarion or altissimo note. Sorry. Yeah, so that's the first type of multiphonics we're going over. Next week we'll talk a little bit more about the multiphonics that use a Xiaoyumo register note fingering. So like your low E multiphonics and whatnot. Yeah, I'll see you next week.